Okay, part three, this channel, my art, and talking about where we fit in and other commentary and perspective on martial arts. So let's talk about the recent upsurge of Brazilian martial arts. Uh, Brazil is a country that actually has an incredibly rich martial tradition. Um, if you look at the history of Brazil, even though in boxing, and they've had some great fighters, but they haven't been as prominent. Virtually all the wrestling systems, all the Asian martial arts from Japan are well represented, and this includes Western systems of wrestling like Catch Can, Lancashire, and other such. They all were part of Brazilian culture where they were used in matches, they were in carnivals and entertainment. People were very well exposed to these different fighting traditions, okay? And those include even indigenous, like, for example, something like luta livre, which is a joint locking art. It's not jujitsu, it's particular to Brazil. You had this incredible brotherhood because the um, Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors came into Japan when it was first opening its doors, and both societies had a very viable combat tradition and they had an exchange. So there's always been a big Japanese presence in Brazil, um, dating back to even the Koryu. And I have actual texts in my library showing exchanges between saber and rapier fighting versus kendo and katana, wakizashi. Actual notes on both parts, both systems, talking about interacting with each other. So Brazil, when it came to this country and exposed whatever, if you want to call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Judo, whatever the case may be, came with certain presuppositions that a lot of them fit into our own culture, which basically deals with social aspects of violence, socially sanctioned aspects. So I've heard a YouTube commentator who I'm very fond of put it as white suburban martial arts, this kind of ethic and understanding of martial arts has to do with, hey, you want to fight? Let's go outside. Let's fight. Okay. Now, that's not necessarily a horrible thing, except there's a big difference between how to deal with those situations and life and death and combat on the street, which is much more extreme than that perspective. Okay. Fighting the schoolyard bully is great when you're young or when it's a matter of social status fighting, but it does not translate in its entirety to life and death situations. With that said, what you tend to see with socially sanctioned violence is that it can be very dangerous, but it's also imminently avoidable. And avoidance is a very strong strategy to be safe from those forms of violence. I say this as somebody who bounced for many, many years, maybe 15, 20 years, having seen all kinds of violent actions in that context. And yeah, I can tell you with some certainty that you can avoid most situations of socially sanctioned violence. You cannot avoid attacks on the street or life and death when somebody's coming after you. There's a big difference. So keep that in mind. Now, one of the problems with taking this new epoche of socially sanctioned combat where you go to MMA in a gym, learn how to box, learn how to use jiu-jitsu, wrestle, is that there's a tendency for people to say, if it doesn't work against a knife, multiple opponents with weapons, you can't defend against that. That is ignorant, and it will get you killed. That's not true. Your training will determine how you're able to protect yourself. And in a life and death situation, being able to survive is the goal, not a trophy, not dominating your opponent, not submitting somebody. And it's entirely feasible to be able to do so at great odds if you understand how weapons are an equalizer, how to deal with those situations, if you train properly. So keep that in mind, because these same individuals often undermine things like women's self-defense. There's one YouTube guy who always tries to parody women's self-defense, which is equally ignorant and stupid, because women are not socialized in violence as men are coming up, okay? Even the idea of making a fist to hit somebody, to a lot of women, was never really part of their understanding. So men have a major advantage that way. And one way to deal with training women properly is to give them confidence, especially if you realize that technique in and of itself doesn't really matter. If a woman does a silly technique or a great technique, there's so many other variables that are important to make that work, that to be critical at that level, and then to say that because a woman can punch, kick, and grapple, that she can survive a vicious attack from somebody trying to do her harm who's bigger and stronger, that is a stretch as well, unless you're training to be able to deal with those attacks and understand how to use equalizers like weapons. So it's a great disservice to mock women who are trying to do that. Similar to training dogs, believe it or not. And I know that'll get me in trouble, I'm sorry, but sometimes when you're training a dog, you have to give it confidence. You have to let it win. Now, once women, the major thing for them is, you put on one of those suits that people put, the bullet suit, let them smack you around in context. That's much more integral to getting them ready to train than this idea that, well, this technique will work, this technique won't work. And you don't really use technique in that situation, do you? Not initially. You have to learn how to fight into technique anyway. All of us do. So keep that in mind. Aside from that, there's a lot of good commentary on YouTube. There are a lot of very good people who don't ridicule what others do. Ridiculing can be insidious, and it starts harmlessly enough. You have the people who are obviously really nut jobs and frauds. But then some of these content providers, they sort of work their way up. And for example, now there's a big thing where some creators are saying the Bujinkan is a scam. One particular idiot was talking about the fifth Dan test that Hatsumi administers. And he was trying to make the case that in a couple of tests out of maybe, he showed 10 or 15, maybe 2, Hatsumi did some sort of weird gesture to make sure somebody passed. Now, if you looked at those tests, you would realize that Hatsumi did those gestures in virtually all the tests. So his understanding of why and what was happening, he simply didn't know. Now, I don't pretend to know. I've been the Buj. I understand the fifth Dan test, what it's supposed to represent, but Hatsumi doing that a certain way, I don't really understand his purpose. But the difference is, when you ridicule somebody and you don't understand, ultimately it makes you look like the stupid one. Anyway, these are some examples of content to stay away from. On the other hand, when people are looking at different martial artists and showcasing some of their skill sets, those are wonderful things to take advantage of. Okay, we'll do our third part now.